Good afternoon, everyone. You're here with the B&H virtual event space. My name is Fred. If you're looking for Derek's friendly, familiar face, he's off on a well-deserved rest, so you'll just have to make do with this one. Today, we're going to learn how to choose the right lens with Kristen Ryan, and it's hosted by Sigma. She'll be going through her process for choosing a lens, be it wide or telephoto, to best tell the story of the scene. Hi, Kristen, and welcome.
Hi, thank you. Happy to be here with everybody today.
All right. We've also got Aaron Norberg here to help answer any of your technical questions. So whether you're watching on our YouTube or Vimeo or on the event space page itself, please feel free to pop your questions into the chat for Kristen or Aaron. Kristen's got a good presentation ahead of us. So without any further ado, why don't I shovel off and you can take it away.
All right, let me just share my screen here. All right, great. Okay, great. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Choosing the Right Lens, Wide Angle to Telephoto Landscapes. So happy you're here. Thank you so much to B&H and Sigma for having me today. I'm really excited about this topic because it's something I'm very passionate about, using multiple focal lengths and how I go about choosing what lens, what focal length to tell my story and various stories within a scene. Before we dive in, I just wanted to introduce myself to those who may not know me. I'm a landscape and nature photographer from the Midwest. I've lived in or outside Chicago for the last 29 years. I'm a mom of 4 kids ranging in ages from 12 to 17. And being a mom of 4 kids and a landscape photographer, I'm pretty busy, and sometimes it's hard to manage my time with both of those things. It doesn't always allow me to get out and explore as much as I'd like, but it definitely makes me value my time in nature and with my camera even more. Although I've lived in Chicago area most of my life, I grew up visiting my grandparents every year at their home in the Tetons. I fell in love with the mountains at a very early age, and I feel it's really where my love of nature was cultivated. I've always loved to capture my life and travel with my camera, but it was really 2011, shortly after my twins were born, that I finally took the plunge to learn how to control my camera. I dove right in, and it's just taken off since then. But not long into my learning, I took a solo trip, escaping my 4 little kids, out to the Tetons, hiking and exploring with my camera. And that's really the spark that led me to landscape and nature photography. A few years later, I started to teach an online landscape photography class with an online forum, and that really led to the development of this community and group of women that I really started to enjoy. So in 2017, I launched my first ladies landscape photography retreat in the Tetons. Over the last few years, I've expanded those retreats to places like Banff, Chicago, Hilton Head, and Glacier National Park. Getting out into the world with my camera brings me into the moment where I'm able to forget about my daily routine and worries, because all I'm focusing on is the beauty in front of me and how I'm going to capture that in my viewfinder. I'm grateful for each opportunity I get to do this and the chance to connect with others who find enjoyment and inspiration in the same ways that I do. I love that photographing nature pushes me outside to spend a little more time noticing, exploring, and slowing down while I enjoy the beauty and details that draw me in. As we go out to explore with our cameras, I believe we can create compelling images with any camera or lens that might be in our hand at the time. But that said, different lenses are tools that provide us with varied opportunities, and not every lens is the perfect choice to capture every story that you want to tell. So the choice of lens and focal lengths is one of the first choices that we make when we begin to set up our frame. So first, I wanted to share with you the lenses that I have used to create all of the images in this presentation, and there are 3 of them. So the Sigma 14 f1.8 art lens is my very wide angle lens. My Sigma 24 to 105 f4 art lens is that great mid-range. I love this range of focal lengths, and it's on my camera just majority of the time. I have 2 camera bodies, so I often have one lens on one and another lens on the other. And the third one is the 150 to 600 f5 to 6.3 contemporary lens. And these really allow me a great range of focal lengths from 14 millimeters to 600. So in this presentation today, I will share my thoughts on why I choose these particular lenses or the focal lengths within them to capture a scene. And I have many examples for these 3 lenses. Talk about how focal length choice can make a dramatic difference in the way a scene is photographed and the story that we tell to a viewer. And another bonus is that using a variety of lenses and focal lengths can help us to create a handful of uniquely compelling images from a single location. And I think that's an especially great thing as busy people who have many other aspects of our lives, that when we get out and can immerse ourselves in nature, we can use our various lenses to create more than one compelling image in an outing. So I think it's good to note that when I talk about choosing a lens and what might be the right lens in any particular location in any moment, there isn't necessarily one right choice. I think the right choice is the one that tells the story that you want to tell in that moment. So the question I always ask myself as I'm preparing a photograph is, what is it that's drawing my eye to the scene? What is it that's drawing me in? Why am I going to click the shutter? What is the story I want to remember? What is the story I want to tell to another viewer? And the answers to those questions are what lead me to choosing a lens and how I'm going to compose my image. It helps me determine what I want to include and also what I want to exclude in order to tell that story. So some questions I might ask myself as I, take my time and think about, what it is that is making me excited to be where I am. What is drawing my curiosity and my interest? What am I, maybe if I'm with someone, kind of elbowing them and say, wow, look at that. So perhaps I'm really drawn into the expanse of the scene. So a really wide, maybe it's so vast and amazing. There could be a really colorful or dramatic sky that I want to make sure I'm including a lot of it. Or it could be a pocket of light hitting a mountaintop or a group of trees where I really want more to isolate a certain aspect, smaller segment of the grand landscape. Or maybe it's a pattern, texture, or shapes within the scene, where again, I might want to eliminate distracting elements and hone in on the specific elements that are drawing me in. So answering these questions leads me to my choices. So I'm thinking, what do I want to exclude or include? And just as importantly, exclude. Do I want to capture the whole entire scene, or is it just a smaller segment? Do I need a wide angle to get large subjects that are close to me, or the vastness? Maybe if the sky is really compelling and dramatic, then often we want to include that, and it will often be a grander scene. If it's kind of boring, maybe we want to minimize the sky or exclude it completely. And then I'm also thinking, is my subject close to me or far away? So those are a lot of the questions. I'm thinking a little more consciously, some, kind of come with practice. It's more instinctual. So to start with, I'm going to talk about the 14 millimeter f1.8 and what I think is fantastic about it. And when I choose that, I love the 14 millimeter lens because it captures a lot of environment, and it's great for capturing those large objects that are close to you in the frame. So like really close mountains, or especially if you want to capture sky, mountains, a distant subject and foreground, and be able to get all of that into your frame. So again, it's fantastic for maximizing those dramatic skies, and it's really excellent in low light and night photography. So this image, for example, in Glacier National Park, this was during blue hour, and at Mini Glacier, and the mountains are huge and they're pretty close to you. And I wanted to get that expansive view, including rocks in the foreground, plus enough sky. 14 millimeter was the perfect choice for that. I have up here cons, and they're not necessarily cons, but maybe things if you just, thinking about how you're telling your story, it's good to be aware that there does sometimes with these really wide angle lenses to have a little distortion around the edges, and that's pretty common. So just to be aware of that, and you can fix it or embrace it. And then really wide angle lenses make objects appear smaller than they are and further away. So for example, these mountains, when you're there, they feel really, really impressive. And the widest angle lenses get a lot into the frame, but they do make those mountains or city buildings feel a little bit smaller than they do in person. So if you're going for, I want to make these objects feel really big and impressive, then the super wide isn't maybe your best choice. But if you want to get a really wide expanse and you want that sky and foreground and everything in the frame, then it's perfect. So it's just something to think about when you're choosing to use a wide angle lens. So here are some images where I also choose to use a 14 millimeter 1.8, and it was perfect for the scene. This is Banff National Park. This is Bow Lake, and it is an incredibly impressive, wide, vast scene with just this huge main mountain peak in front of you, mountains on either side. I was there in early November of last year. That's when this image is from, this truly breathtaking sunrise. And I wanted to capture these little ice flowers on the surface of the lake in the foreground and get, the mountain's reflection and the top of the mountain as much as I could. And the 14 millimeter was just perfect for this. This is, just what I needed to capture this scene and bring it home where I could feel the way I did in that moment. Here's a completely different scene in which I chose the Sigma 14 1.8. This is on the coast of California near Dana Point. And I chose the 14 here as I wanted to compose this with a lot of foreground, all these rocks that were really beautiful leading up to the ocean. A slower shutter speed to get that soft water. I wanted to include that cliff in the distance, and you can see that tiny little moon up in the sky that is not certainly prominent in the sky, but it was something I wanted to include here in the frame. And the 14 was perfect to really include this whole scene and just that feeling of the wide open ocean in front of me. Here's another scene from Glacier National Park that is 14 millimeters. And I chose this lens here because I was standing at this viewpoint at Sun Point, and the sky was incredible. You can kind of see there are like storm clouds forming over to the right, a little hints of light. And I loved the rocks that were on the ground in front of me as well. So I got all the way down on the rocks, and I did have to focus stack this just for if anyone's wondering about getting that whole entire scene in focus. I had to do that in this particular image, but the 14 really allowed me to get, right on the ground and get all the way from that foreground plus a lot of the dramatic sky. So this was perfect. The mountains here, again, mountains feel a little smaller with the super wide, but for me, this particular shutter click was all about the atmosphere and the vast environment, mood, and all the elements of where I was standing. Here's a great example of that night and low light. This is blue hour. And also this is where I had mountains fairly close to me. And I wanted to also be able to capture that foreground as well as, a fair amount of sky. This was pre-Milky Way shooting during the blue hour, and some clouds had floated through. So I wanted to use a long exposure, capture the cloud movement. You can see a hint of the Milky Way starting to come up over in the very left side of the frame. But the 14 really allowed me to photograph this, wider environment of the mountains, the lake, and the sky above. Here's an example of how it's really great in cities, especially when you're close to the buildings. This is in Chicago from a couple years back in the spring, shooting along one of the bridges. I love the line of the river here leading towards the Trump Tower. And one of the reasons I chose the 14 millimeter for this image is I wanted to get the full height of the Trump Tower and the buildings on either side of the river. But I also really wanted to get those diagonal lines coming in from the corners because I liked the lead in of the river. So the 14 allowed me to get all of that in the frame and keep those sides in the frame. And on the left, my image actually goes a little bit further out than those little hearts on the building. But this presentation crops it just a slightly different ratio. I did just want to quickly note that the moon up at the top was shot with a telephoto and composited in here. The 14, the moon was a tiny little speck. So I did use a telephoto lens and put that into this image so that the final image, the moon would feel as it did to me in person. That's not something I do often, but I did in this image, and just so that no one thinks they can get a moon quite that big with a 14 millimeter lens. I think that's important to note. So I do have some a couple 14 millimeter images in some scenes where I later will share locations where I have images with different focal lengths from one morning or evening. But now I want to talk about the Sigma 24 to 105, why I love this lens, and share with you some images that I have taken with it and why I chose this lens and why I love it. It captures that wider environment at our wider focal lengths of 24 millimeters and, some of the other little bit closer in, but we can also zoom in for more detail. And it's such a versatile range, 24 to 105. It's on, I have a Z6 and a Z7 too, and it's usually on one of those bodies all the time. Often I'll have my 150 to 600 on the other and then change in the 14 when I need that really wide view. The 24 to 105 gives us that real life view more as we see it with our eyes in those middle focal lengths. And there's very little distortion. So you kind of, some of it, you don't get those edges on the side like the really wide angle. So some of my favorite images with the 24 to 105. Here, the first one, this is a beautiful sunrise at Taggart Lake in Grand Teton National Park. And this is a 36 millimeters, so not the widest of this lens, but on the wider side. And here I chose to use a 36 millimeter focal length as I wanted to include some sky up to where the clouds, sort of to where the clouds were. I didn't have a lot of clouds above the ones you see. I wanted to include the mountains reflection and some of the, the water in the lake. So some beautiful foreground. 36 allowed me to keep the mountains not too far away, not too small. They feel impressive, but I was also able to include a lot of environment here. Similar, this one is at 48 millimeters. So this gives us a little bit closer in view, making the mountains a little more prominent in the frame. This morning was pretty magical. As soon as the sun started to come up over Mount Rundle, all this fog came in and got lit up by the sunlight. There weren't any clouds above this scene, so I zoomed in a little bit more to take away some of that negative space that would have just drawn the eye away from the highlight of the sunburst and the fog and the mountains. But on the flip side of this image, while entranced by the mountains and the light there, the light kept changing through the fog and the trees. And this was taken that same morning. There were so many intimate scenes within these fog and trees that I couldn't even possibly capture everyone. But this one is my favorite one. And I was really drawn to the way there were some like diagonals and triangles, and the play of light and shadow, warm and cool tones was really intriguing to me. So here I used the longest of the 24 to 105 focal lengths, so 105, to really isolate the trees, fog, and that light and color contrast. So two very different images, both favorites of mine, but just completely different, just by responding to what I was looking at. And, you know, sometimes in a case like this, I could barely capture everything that was intriguing to me because the light kept changing, and it was so incredible throughout the scene. This is another example at that longer focal length of 105. And this is in Glacier National Park. It was a rainy morning as the rain started to finish. Went out driving, and along one of the mountainsides, there was all these low clouds and fog floating through these evergreen trees. So I zoomed in on some of the pockets where I was intrigued with the patterns and lines of the evergreen. And I really love the way the soft fog contrasts with the texture of the trees. So this allowed me to, you know, zone in on certain pockets that I found visually appealing, where these clouds were moving. Here's an example of two images that were taken in the same location, same afternoon, just using the 24 to 105 at either end. So I went up to Hidden Falls in Grand Teton National Park one late afternoon. This was, I think, June of last year. So I spent an afternoon there. I hadn't been up there in a while, and I ended up having like an hour to myself, which was kind of crazy. But I started out, since I hadn't been there for a while, wanting to capture the full falls. So that's what you see in the upper left. And then after I photographed the full falls, I kind of sat there and just kind of watched. And one of the things that had really drawn me in was the way the water was really splashing at the top. They were full of water. There was, you know, the water changes over the course of the seasons, and there was a lot there just spraying. So in that bottom right image, I zoomed in tighter and just captured that spray and feeling of a lot of water up there at the top. So two images, one wide and one tighter in. Oops. And then here's another example, not the extreme focal lengths of the 24 to 105, but also using the 24 to 105 at a wider and longer focal length. So on the upper left, we have 32 millimeters. And this was perfect for me here. This was a morning, it was raining when we got there, just incredible sunrise, the rain went away, still sort of stormy light coming through. And I wanted to capture that whole feeling. I really is careful to capture that left side of the Snake River as it goes down toward the mountains. And I wanted, you know, some of that dramatic sky and some grasses in the foreground. The 32 millimeters allowed me to fit that all in the frame, but also not going too wide in order to have the mountains a little bit bigger than, say, if I'd used my 14. So, you know, that is kind of the thought process that goes into, you know, why I would choose that particular lens and focal length. And then down on the right, I zoomed in a little bit tighter. I took out the water and just zoomed in more on the mountains as that pink light, soft golden pink light hit the Grand Teton at 75 millimeters. And this brought the mountains even closer, really kind of makes it about that, the mountains and that light right there. So a little bit different story, just by, it's a different moment, but also taking advantage of that moment that was grabbing me and telling a little bit different story. So moving on to some things I love about the 150 to 600 f5 to 6.3 contemporary lens. I use this lens all of the time. I bought this lens a whole number of years ago, thinking, I'll use this for, the occasional wildlife I see when I'm traveling. Maybe my kids were playing like soccer at the time, like outdoor sports. And I kept taking it to the Tetons, and that's where I really started using it. Not only for the random wildlife I'd see, but I started using it quite often for landscape photography and intimate landscapes, and discovering the more I used it, the more I loved it. And I just use it all the time. And it has so many benefits because it lets me zoom in on far off scenes that I can't get to with my feet. And that is with landscape photography, that's can be the case. We can't get to a tree across the water. We can't get closer without using a telephoto, or the tip of a mountain peak. There's so many situations where we can't physically get closer. And this lens allows me to do that with my camera. It isolates details in an otherwise busy scene, and it also eliminates boring or distracting elements. So when we're talking about, what we want to include or exclude, this lens really helps you to zone in on what you want to include and take out some of the distractions. So it allows me to focus on shapes and textures, pockets of light. It's a really great choice for less than ideal conditions. When we say less than ideal conditions, it might be less than ideal conditions and then it's raining, or just conditions that don't necessarily allow for great grand landscapes. And as talked about, it helps to bring a subject closer, enhancing its size and its presence, the opposite of what a really wide angle lens does, and making something feel smaller or further away. So a quick note about this lens when using it, it is, it's as a large telephoto lens, it's bigger, it's a little heavier. If you're able to use a tripod to help you out, I highly encourage you to do so. But I do often use this lens handheld, and through my own experience, I've discovered for me that I tend to need a minimum of 1/1000 shutter speed when I'm shooting handheld. I would encourage you to find your own happy place. We're all a little different in terms of our steadiness. I can sometimes get away with 1/800, but I'm usually 1/1000, 1/1250. And when I'm using it handheld, sometimes I do find it easier to nail in that pocket, the scene that I want. And if I'm not using the tripod or can't for whatever reason, I'm not afraid to raise ISO in order to make sure that my shutter speed is high enough so I don't get that camera shake and blur. So just a couple tips I would suggest keeping in mind from my experience. So some examples to start off with. This is just a perfect example of how I often use this lens in less than ideal conditions. This was a really rainy day in September of 2019. In the Tetons, it was just kind of blah, like overcast, drizzly, raining, and still went out exploring to one of the lakes, and it was drizzling. The grand landscape was, not too exciting with the white sky, but the clouds were floating through these evergreen trees. And so I just grabbed the 150 to 600 and found some pockets of the trees where I really liked the pattern they were creating. And This was one of my favorite images from the trip, and definitely very unexpected. So I have found that it often will help me create images that aren't something I would have dreamt that I would take and love. So it has taught me from when I started using it to definitely always have an open mind. So here's a great example of responding to something that draws your eye, makes you stop and think, and then figuring out how to capture it while eliminating distractions. This was in Smoky Mountain National Park. I was pulled over at one of the overlook pullouts, actually photographing a different direction where the light was just illuminating lots of fall colors. And I would, as I always do, I kind of look all around me, and I was drawn to this interesting branch. And the way that there were, such a rainbow of colors from red, yellow, orange, green, surrounding it. But right under this branch area, there was the park road, and there was just constant traffic because it was a really busy time. So even though this one spot was interesting, the wider shot was a little bit distracting. So my 150-600 at 200 millimeters allowed me to capture these fall colors and this interesting branch while eliminating the distraction of the road and the cars. And you would never know there was a road there. So that's kind of fun. This is also an example of eliminating cars and traffic. This is from I was standing at the parking lot of the iconic Oxbow Bend. And this peak sits a bit off to the right from where is like the main iconic shot of Mount Moran. And while I was out there with one of my ladies' retreats, we were working on long exposures of clouds over Moran. And I was looking around and noticed these beautiful lines of fall colors developing with the clouds over this peak. So I grabbed my 150-600 because right beneath those yellow trees at the bottom is the park road where there were like RVs parked. And so the wide shot of this particular scene was very distracting and not all that interesting. But zoning in on just these layers of trees and the atmosphere above the peak was what was calling to me in that moment. This is an example of an image that I would definitely have never dreamt of taking. In July of 2020, I was out in the Tetons with my family, went out for sunrise while they slept. And then while I was driving back to them, I noticed sunlight streaming through trees on Blacktail Butte. And not the whole butte, but just certain pockets of light. And I couldn't just pull over on the highway, on the park road, wherever. So I kept on driving and kept on being drawn to this light, and finally found a place I could kind of turn onto a different street and pull over in a little pull-out spot. So in order to really isolate just the pocket of trees where the light came in, I had to zoom in all the way at 600 millimeters just to, to kind of find those rays and triangles of light and shadow that were making me look as I drove down the road. This was one of my favorites from that trip, and I wouldn't have expected. It's definitely not something I would have imagined coming home with. So that was fun. Fog is something that I actually love. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's not an ideal condition, but sometimes, if you're looking for like a wider view, it can hide everything at times. So that might not be so ideal. Pulling up to my first time at Klingman's Dome, there was a ton of fog and not too much of a wide view. But there were a few little pockets of, little views, and I looked up and saw these empty tree trunks amongst evergreens with fog floating through them, and found the juxtaposition of the soft fog and the white tree trunks against these green evergreens, these textures and lines to be really interesting. So 600 millimeters allowed me to get close enough to just isolate this little section of the hillside. This is a situation where I actually spent quite a bit of time shooting wider. This was a sunset in, I think, fall of 2019. And for most of the evening, I was a little further back with a wider angle, capturing light coming into the sagebrush as the sun went down in the sky. And I had walked over to the car, I think, to maybe grab a jacket or grab something or put something in the car. And as I turned away from the car, the sun had gone behind the mountains, and I looked up, and this triangle of light was just covering the tips of the peaks, including the Grand. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. So I grabbed a longer lens, because at this point, the light was really isolated to the mountain peaks, and a little bit of light coming into the foreground, closer to the mountains, not so close to me. So 150 millimeters allowed me to isolate that light just on the peaks with the fall color below. And as I said earlier, the longer focal lengths really allow you to enhance the majesty, the size and presence of a subject in your frame. So this is a great example where it really does bring those mountains closer and makes them feel very impressive and large here. Another, this is a wintry example of the 150 to 600 being great when your wider scenes are just not working for you. This was this past winter in the Tetons, tons of snow and clouds covering the mountains. I used my 150 to 600 more than any other lens during that week, and found a lot of beauty that wasn't the mountains. And this is one of my favorites. This pocket of trees seemed to find its way into my heart that week. And this was on one of the really snowy days, but 220 millimeters isolated the trees that, were really calling to me in my head. This is actually a double exposure. I used a tripod here and focused on the snowflakes closer to me for one, and then on the trees for the second one. So, whoops. This image is just an example of, again, like bringing those mountains really closer, isolating light and shadow and drama. I was driving along the park road, and all of a sudden the light was just amazing. I wasn't really in a position where the wider shot was one of my favorite views, and I just really wanted to isolate that light and shadow and the clouds over the peaks. So pulled out the 150 to 600. This is 230 millimeters to isolate those textures and light and shadow. And before I kind of go into some sessions where I have multiple focal length images to share and how I approached, I wanted to just share this image as well. This is more of a detail shot that could look like a macro image, but the 150-600 can be a really great lens for, with its compression, for capturing detail like these grasses and droplets with morning light coming through. I grabbed this lens because I loved the way it would create this dreamy and soft look. And when I only have so much room in my bag, I might not have my macro lens, and this really allows me to respond to some details and those small scenes that I see as I'm exploring. So, as I mentioned earlier, I love that, thinking about various focal lengths and what is speaking to me, and how different lenses and focal lengths allow me to tell different stories. I love that I can capture unique and different images in a single location when I'm out. So a few different examples of times when I used multiple lenses to create different stories in one place. So this one is this, beautiful overlook of the Tetons. This is 14 millimeters. And this isn't my favorite shot from that day, but I love the way it captures such a vast view and got the sunburst. And it's a great pullback, I think, for showing the difference between focal lengths and lens choice. You can see how we see the valley in the foreground, the sky, and then the mountains, but the mountains aren't as prominent as in some of the next images that I'm going to share. So down in the right lower shot, you can see is 62 millimeters. And that one really still shows the valley. The mountains are pretty far away, which is one reason that 14 makes them so small, because they're not really close to us or close to you at that particular vantage point. And then you can compare that to the upper right is 150 millimeters, which really brings them pretty close and makes them feel impressive. And then the vertical image is just an isolation of the grand, as that sunset light was, coming at it from that left side as we look at it. So that's a completely different perspective where I isolated that light. And then on the right side of the frame, we have Mount Moran. And as that sunset progressed, the light was hitting the hillside and these lines and layers, a mix of light and shadow that was very intriguing. So here I have, one vertical and one horizontal image where I use the 150 to 600 to bring that closer to isolate those details. Here is, this is Oxbow Bend, and in the upper right, you can see this is my widest of these three shots at 58 millimeters. At my vantage point, I'm pretty far from the mountains. So I really didn't go too much closer than 58, which sometimes seems kind of strange, but here I had just enough sky and reflection to surround the mountains and give that feeling of the whole environment. And this is a 60-second exposure to show the movement of those clouds and low fog and mist. And then beneath that one, I have 90 millimeters, also with a 24 to 105. And this one was a little bit later, just to isolate Mount Moran and make Moran feel a little bit bigger, capture those clouds that were sitting right at the top, but still have that environment of the fog coming from the left. And then I went even longer here, isolating this tree on the left. The vertical image was that tree sits to the east. And I always love this tree when there's atmosphere around it, the way it reflects in the water. So this one's at 150 millimeters to capture that as the mist and fog was floating through. So 3 completely different images, just with, different focal lengths and 2 different lenses. Little bit different environment here. This is on the southern coast of Kauai. Just a stormy, moody sunset evening. I got rained on several times while I was out there, but it was really stunning. The winds were pretty strong, so the waves were really crashing against the coast. The upper left is at the widest of the 24 to 105 at 24 millimeters. This is a long exposure to capture that movement in the clouds, blended with a faster shutter to keep those green plants in the foreground from being blurry. And I really loved this wide view that really captured the atmosphere of the evening. As I looked towards the west, where the sun was setting, there was this area of waves that were just crashing on the rocks and spraying above. And I loved the power of those waves, but I couldn't get closer walking on the rocks. It wouldn't have been safe. So I used my 150 to 600 at 360 millimeters with a faster shutter speed to freeze that spray of the water that was kind of glowing in the light of the sun going down. So 2 completely different images, different lenses and focal lengths to tell 2 different stories of what I was experiencing on that one evening. And then this one is a very chilly morning last November at Emerald Lake. Starting at the top, we have 14 millimeters, the 14 millimeter 1.8. And I use this lens here to start with as the sunrise was happening, just super beautiful with mist coming off the lake and clouds floating by. That really captured lots of the lake and also the little restaurant there on the right. But as the light changed and the clouds floated, I also noticed a lot of interesting scenes, in the mountains across the lake and just various details. So on the right side below, this one is with 95 millimeters. I would love the way the light and shadow and clouds were floating across these mountain peaks. And then two more from that morning. Upper left is also across the lake in those mountains, just noticing the shapes and the light as it was hitting some of those trees that were dusted in snow. That one's at 600 millimeters, so zoomed in pretty tight. And then on the bottom right are those some frosty branches that were sitting in the lake. I loved those details, super snowy. So 600 millimeters to isolate them in their reflection. And I kept that one with a really cool white balance because that morning was like -13. So it was crazy cold and I wanted that image to reflect that. Just a couple more I'll quickly go through because I know we're running out of time. I think there's only one more after this set. These were both captured in one of the pristine lakes in Grand Teton National Park. And this one on the top, the top left, it should be the top, it says the top right, but that should be the top left is 14 millimeters to get that sky. It was a beautiful sunrise. So I wanted the sky, the mountains, and the whole reflection. And being really close to the mountains at this lake, in order to get all of that in, you need to go, you need a wide angle. Otherwise, you can't get a lot of it in. So that was perfect to capture that full scene. But on the flip side at this lake, I love the way we also get some of the reflections of the trees and the rocks. So the bottom right image is at 150 millimeters, just zooming in on those reflections. And this is the same lake. The right side is Mount Moran reflecting in the lake at 42 millimeters with the 24 to 105. This is just a different perspective, standing in a different spot than the grand that was in the first image, and also a little later in the morning. And then the image on the left was a little tree I noticed as I walked up to the lake, and just I hadn't noticed it before to my prior visits to this lake, but one morning I noticed it. And over the course of the morning, I noticed that the sunlight had started to move and illuminate that little tree. And later, just a little bit, the rock started to get some light. And so I used my 150 to 600 at 150 millimeters to just isolate that little tree and frame it between the trees on the left and the rock on the right. So 4 different images with different focal lengths, and of course responding to how the light changes as well, because as the light changes, conditions change. Sometimes we have different things are brought to our attention that make us interested and curious. And this is the last scene, just 3 totally different images, different focal lengths from a morning at Schwabacher's Landing. On the upper right, you can see 24 millimeters to capture that just after sunrise light coming in. And then after sunrise, walking along the path and noticing these gorgeous sun rays coming through the trees, which you can see in my vertical image on the left. I used a 105 millimeter focal length so that I could really isolate those rays and make them feel a little more prominent in the frame. And then I also had those details of lupin lit up against a darker background, and zoomed in here for some compression at 360 millimeters with my 150 to 600. So 3 completely different images, all from the same location, same morning, just from wandering around and choosing a lens based on what I was seeing. So conclusion is, lens choice plays a big role in capturing your creative vision and how you tell your story. And just, depending on what you choose, what you include and what you exclude can really determine what comes across in your image and what you're telling the story of. Using multiple lenses and focal lengths can also open up your creativity and allow you to respond to different things in a location. And then you can come away with multiple unique and different images from that same location to help you tell a greater story of that place, of your experience there, and your memories of it. So lastly, again, here are the 3 lenses that I used to capture the images throughout this presentation. So I hope that maybe this will give you a little inspiration next time you go out. And if anyone has any questions, I am happy to answer them.
Great. That was awesome.
Thanks.
You have a great flow of images. It was awesome to see, especially the same scenes and how they're treated between the 3 different lenses. I think it's going to give some people that are probably sitting on only one lens when they come out a little more leeway or a reason to bring out more of their lenses with them or to pick up one. Before my own questions, let's go to who's more important, the watching at home. We have a comment and questions from a gentleman named Garrison on the Zoom. He says, gorgeous and mystical imagery. Your work feels like a synthesis of the films Narnia and A Hidden Life. He has 3 questions, so we'll go one by one. Okay. Have you done cinematic photography, images that look like frames from a movie? I guess, were you ever inspired that way?
I wouldn't say so. No, I feel like I'm just more inspired by my own feelings out in nature rather than reflecting back to films. Not that would be a bad way to be inspired. I just feel like I most get inspired because I'm immersed in a place that takes over how I'm feeling. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Who are your photography heroes?
Oh, goodness. Well, I don't even know, but there's one person that has always inspired me is Tom Mangelson, partly because he's one of the first photographers I was familiar with. He lived near he still actually lives near where my grandparents lived in Wyoming. So I think they had his art in their house before I think he even had all his galleries. And so I became familiar with what he did and the wildlife and nature. And that was always something that was inspiring to me.
Tom Ingelson, you said?
Thomas Mangelson.
Mangelson, yeah. Awesome.
He's from Wyoming and he does wildlife and nature photography. Yeah.
And then Garrison's last question is, are you familiar with the slow photography movement? And he has a couple of names listed.
Yes.
You are? Okay.
Yes.
So there you go, Garrison.
Yeah. Yes. And I know the people who brought that about as well. Yeah. I embrace that principle of slow photography and taking time and making that connection to where I am, to the nature before. I mean, of course, if like light is overcoming you as you are driving or something, that you respond to it, but also just taking that time to let the nature speak to me and kind of guide me towards what I want to photograph. Yeah. Thank you for your questions.
Thanks, Kristen. We actually have another question coming in from Tina Robinson on YouTube. And it sort of plays into my question a little bit. She's asking, what tripod do you use? And I'm going to expand on her question a little bit more. So we've went over the lenses, but are there any other accessories that are a must-have in your bag at all times?
Oh, sure. Well, so the tripod that I have is the Peak Design travel tripod. And I love it. I love it, love it, love it, because it's so light. It's so easy to use. Like putting the camera on. I have an L bracket on my camera bodies. It makes it super simple. So I actually have 2 of those tripods, because sometimes if I'm doing like a long exposure and I want to be able to, or a time lapse and I want to do something on a second, like sometimes I'm using 2 tripods, and I actually used to curse the other one. So I finally just got a second one. Actually, I try to keep one just as beach and one non-beach because of the sand and salt water. It's like unavoidable. With my 150 to 600, it's not the best. I will say that, but I deal with it because it really works for everything else that I need right now. So,
and since it's light enough, you're actually willing to bring it out with you in the first
place.
Yeah.
And I will use it with that lens, but like I wouldn't like walk away from it. Mm-hmm. I mean, I'll use it for extra support. It's just I don't know, if I wouldn't think it's the ideal tripod for if you're always using like that lens on a tripod. But I also use that lens a lot handheld. So anyway, that really works for me. Other things, L bracket, as I said, I love my neutral density filters. I love long exposure photography. So I pretty much always have my ND filters and a polarizer in my bag. Trying to think what else. That comes to mind immediately as something that I always have, which obviously if I'm doing long exposures, tripods go along with that. So yeah.
We have a question from Marcelino on Vimeo. How do you feel about prime lenses? Well, from the 14, it looks like she's a backer of at least one of them, definitely.
Yeah. I think prime lenses can be great. I think whatever works for you in what you find you're photographing. I do obviously tend to use the zooms a little bit more, because they give that versatility when you can't be moving. And I like to be able to frame my composition as much as I can in camera without having to, crop too much. So from that respect, having the zoom and, less ability with landscape photography to get closer or further away in a significant way, obviously, you can back up, but like, it's not going to get you much or, much further from the tree or, or you can't get closer on the shore of a lake to a tree, So from that respect, I guess I lean toward the zooms, but I love my 14, so I'm not opposed to prime lenses, and they definitely also are great for astrophotography if that's something. I know I didn't really have any night sky images in this presentation other than like the blue hour, but that 14 I use all the time for astrophotography. And if I wanted to do something closer, I probably will get another prime for that. So I think they're great for a lot of things. Yeah.
Aaron, did you notice any questions come in that you think would be?
I think we've got everything covered that's come in so far.
All right. I have one last question for myself. Looking at the in the camera information that you had up when
Yeah.
you were showing the images,
Mhm.
D810, D850, and then eventually Z6, Z7. Have you
Yeah.
found the transition with these lenses to be smooth?
Yeah.
I'm asking for the people that are currently DSLR shooters and thinking about mirrorless in the future.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So some of my, I did have an 810 and then I had an 850, which I absolutely loved. And then as I started to use the Z6 more than the 850, and then I got rid of the 850, and now I just have Z6 and Z7 too. And these, I don't have any like Z lenses. These lenses, as I switched from my DSLR to my Z6 and Z7, I've had no issues. Like they focus well, the sharpness, everything for me, it's been great. I have no complaints at all. I've had people ask me that. I'm like, they're great. I don't have any complaints.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
highly recommend. Yeah, if switching over from the DSLR to the mirrorless, the adapter works great.
great.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Mhm.
Well, we are just 2 minutes past the hour, so it looks like that'll do it for today. Just a reminder for everyone, B&H is celebrating its 50th anniversary with its Build Expo at the Javits Center in New York City. So if you can make it, especially if you're interested in trying out any of the Sigma lenses talked about today, come on over on September 6th or 7th to the Sigma booth. Their booth number is 422. They will be on hand. Actually, Aaron will be there and he will be able to talk about and demonstrate their lineup of lenses. Team Sigma, Kristen, thank you so much for the excellent workshop.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it very much.
I also want to say thanks to everyone that logged in to check it out. After all, we do this for you guys, for your entertainment and for your education. All right, guys, did I forget anything at all? Great. All right. So this has been another edition of the B&H Virtual Event Space. Guys, until next time, catch you later.